So, roughly over the past year, I've received some questions about my process when I'm starting a piece or figuring out things like pose and anatomy. So, I figured instead of struggling with the drawn out tutorial, I would just do a talk over of one of my pieces I did recently and lay out what my thought process is. Hopefully, it answers your guys' questions or just provides a good amount of insight. I feel it's important for me to touch on something while it's still early in the video, and that's the initial struggle that happens when you first start working. I reblogged this really great video a while back by Justin Oaksford where he addresses it really well, and I recommend you check it out. You can find it in my art advice tag. Because he goes really in detail with it, I'm only going to touch on it, but I will say before what you see in this video, I was struggling for about half an hour with how I was going to tackle this drawing. I think it's important to talk about because so much of the artistic process is struggling. In the early stages, I wasn't too sure about how I wanted to portray Mettaton, and I know my original idea was something more in line with the stance he takes when he first shows off his new body at the beginning of his boss battle. But as I was sketching it out, it just wasn't clicking, and I just wasn't liking the results, and I just felt like it was stiff or just uninteresting. And a lot of the times when I sit down to work, I find the idea in my head isn't necessarily the best approach, so I kind of end up in this phase where I'm just pumping out sketch after sketch, idea after idea, and it's almost like this series of artistic barfing where I'm getting all these really uncreative, gross, stiff ideas out of my system, and once that's all out of there, it's a lot easier to get to like the really good fluid stuff. This video starts off on a pose I felt satisfied with, so you're not seeing any of the struggle I just talked about. But I would like to bring up the fact that I don't have any reference up during this sketching phase. Meaning I'm working completely off memory, and that's important for me because I'm not getting distracted by details or surface design like the hair or the outfit. Instead, I'm simply relying on what do I remember about this character? What do I know about who they are? What makes this character like pop? At the sketching point, details aren't important. And what is important is laying down a good solid foundation for what will hopefully be a good piece. And the body language of the character is a lot more crucial than all the flashy surface design. As for the technical side of it, in this early stage, the anatomy and accuracy isn't what I'm focused on. It's more important to get the idea on the paper in a way I can work off of. And, I mean, I can always lower the opacity or put up a new layer on top of it to clean it up or lasso a section off and adjust it. So there's no pressure that this needs to be good and readable right now. It just needs to convey the concept well enough. I mean, you can see that I'm laying out shapes and I clearly understand enough about the human body to draw it convincingly, but this is all muscle memory and me taking lots of shortcuts, being accurate and, pretty looking isn't really my goal. The first sketch you see me working on in this video is pretty much me roughly laying out a concept and relying on muscle memory to figure out how to portray this character purely from a body language standpoint, and it's a lot more about gesture and details. What you're seeing here, though, in the second sketch, is me taking it to the next stage of cleaning up the pose, figuring out anatomy a little better. At this point, I think I'm more concerned with shapes and figuring out like what shapes Mettaton is made out of, and he's pretty much all triangles. You can see I even gave his torso this sort of upside down Dorito shape. I still don't have reference up at this point. I'm still relying completely on memory. I'm still very much in that mindset of, alright, what do I know about Mettaton? And, one thing I know is the fact that he's very proud of his legs. So clearly when I'm portraying him, there should be an emphasis on that aspect of his character. Judging by Alphys's interest and the inspiration she probably got, Mettaton has a very Bishi style of beauty. And he's much more of a glam bot superstar than this beefy action hero character, so I shouldn't be focusing on portraying him as buff or muscular, and that leads me more to these very slender, soft curves coupled with his characteristic triangular shapes. You'll notice me lassoing and rotating certain areas to push the pose a little further and make it more dramatic. In the early stage, you really want to push a pose because as you pile the details on, some of that gesture and fluidity is going to be lost. And the more you push the pose, the more of that character will be maintained in the finished piece. Just be careful not to push a gesture so much that it breaks. So you can see here that I've started to add the details, and at this point I have pulled up reference. I have it all on another screen. I use 2 monitors when I'm working. So now I'm on the 3rd layer. You could say that this is the 3rd time I am redrawing the initial idea. I'm just adding more to it by building off the previous stage. And that's usually how I work. I start with a base sketch that's very messy, but it's all about getting the idea onto the paper. And the 2nd layer is cleaning up that idea while still trying to keep it loose, but adding more construction to build on. And then we get to the 3rd layer, which is creating that solid base and mixing concept and subject and adding all the details and figuring out what the finished image is going to look like. I don't always work in that many stages. Sometimes I go straight from messy concept sketch to cleaned up sketch or even the final lines, so there's no single way I do this, and I don't rely on a strict process or step-by-step approach. I guess a good example of this would be the Kara and Frisk drawing sketches I posted a while back. Those ones I went straight from messy concept sketch to cleaned up sketch. And there are definitely some cases where I just go straight from concept to cleaned up sketch. So nothing is ever like set in stone when I'm working. And so much of growing as an artist is experimentation, and I almost never sit down to draw with the mentality of this is how I've always done it, so this is how I'm going to do it now. I don't have set brushes or a set canvas size or set color palettes that I always work with. A lot of times when I sit down, my thought process is much more along the lines of, okay, what can I do differently this time? What can I learn if I use this brush instead of what can I mess around with that's going to teach me something new? I really don't like feeling tied down by a set idea. Most of the time, the brushes I use when I'm sketching don't matter as long as it lets me get the idea down quickly and clearly. For these sketches, I think I used Kyle T. Webster's Animator's Pencil, which you can find a link to his brushes in my FAQ. But I wasn't concerned with my brush because all of this would be deleted or erased and wouldn't be even seen in the final piece, so it didn't really matter what brush I was using at this stage. I don't really have a whole lot to talk about at this point in the video. My whole reason for making this was to address questions dealing with how I tackle the early stages of drawing and laying out gestures and pose and the like. So I guess one thing I can talk about is the importance of good construction. I took a drawing fundamentals class this past semester, and one thing the instructor really emphasized is the importance of good construction. If the construction and foundation of your drawing is solid and well drawn, then that's going to carry over into the final drawing. And the same is true for the opposite. No matter how much polish or detail or how well you can paint or shade, a drawing with bad construction is going to look like a badly constructed drawing. It's really important to take the time when you're laying out a drawing to make sure everything looks good in those early construction stages. The more time you put into a piece during the construction stage, the easier it is going to be when you clean it up. Again, this isn't always how I work, but in this piece, I really focused on having a nicely detailed and laid out sketch. So by the time I was ready to clean it up and do the line work, I was pretty much able to turn off my brain and just glide over the sketch. I've actually had people comment that it looks like I work in Paint Tool Sci. And that kind of cracks me up because I'm not a fan of that program at all. Maybe it's because I'm so integrated into Photoshop, but that program just frustrates me and I really can't stand it. That being said, I do get a lot of questions about how I get my lines so clean, and while I know that most people say this, it's really about building confidence. I've got one hand on the keyboard hovering over the Control Z and the other hand making the lines. When it comes to line art, I want to make a line in as few strokes as possible. So if I make a mark and it's not a good mark, I delete and try again. And that's pretty much it. I just draw and delete, draw and Control Z, and I just do it over and over and over again until I get the line that I want. And you'll probably see it a few times in this video where I'm super struggling with a line, and while it goes by super fast because of this video is sped up, in real time, that was probably about a minute of me getting super frustrated with how clean this line was. Staying relatively zoomed out on the piece also helps because that means I can cover larger areas in single strokes. You can see when I first start coloring that I'm doing these quick scribbles on the side and even doing some quick tests on the chest piece. And again, that's me kind of trying to figure out what brushes I want to color with. I guess you could say I'm kind of feeling them out and trying to get a grasp on which ones feel comfortable. Usually I lean more towards Kyle T. Webster's watercolor brushes, which again, you can find a link to them in my FAQ. But this time I really like the texture and the feel of the gouache set. So for the majority of this piece, I used what I think was called the Fat Fun 100, and a few of the gouache detail brushes. I did use a watercolor brush on his arms because I felt it helped give the metal a more fluid, soft, reflective surface look. In terms of choosing colors, I just wanted to stick to pinks and purples, and in order to get those splashes of like different colors that you see, I would mess around with different layer styles and hues until I got something appealing. I guess for the most part, that pretty much sums up this video. You can see the final piece here. Hopefully this provided like a good amount of insight, like I said at the beginning, or just answered general questions. Thank you so much for spending the time on this video, guys.